Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 25th of October, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, the weather, we've got some interesting reports today. Apparently, Norfolk is sunny and absolutely calm and still, so looking particularly good with all the leaves on the trees. Manchester and Dubai, sunny, apparently. Plymouth here a bit cloudy, and Rhonda's on the gloomy side. So we've got a mixture across the scene. Holland also cloudy. So there we are.
Well, it's getting cloudier for the white helmets because this is the Asia Times, and writing in the Asia Times is Christina Lin, who works for the World Health Organization. So this is a bit of an official stamp, shall we say, from the United Nations as to the status of the white helmets. So she's saying that the white helmets funded through the US State Department US aid to the tune of $23 million and $29 million from the UK government. Of course, in the last week or so, they've been given another £36 million on top of that. She goes on to say various disturbing videos and photos have emerged of white helmet members carrying weapons, celebrating with Al-Qaeda whenever they defeated Syrian army in battles, and standing by to watch as rebel jihadists conduct executions, and then immediately rushing forward to place the body in body bags. So she absolutely calling it for what it is, and I think this is a useful intervention from somebody in the United Nations.
It is getting interesting. Let's bring on the Defence Secretary then, Mike, and have a look at what Mr. Fallon has been saying. Now, in the first place, he's been saying this, that British armed forces will be protected against spurious legal claims. But we would like to remind people that over the last few days into the press came this, that basically Britain is going to take over in training what they're calling rebels in Syria. So rebels, terrorists, really. Let's add in then the rest of the comment for Mr. Fallon. This is an analysis by UK Column, but our real intention is to continue to train terrorists so that they can then use their skills on British armed forces. The policy worked well in Afghanistan, Iraq, and will do so in Syria. So this is the reality that, of course, we've got the British government saying that it's training rebels. That's not the case. The British government is helping to train terrorists. And of course, ultimately, those terrorists are going to be turning on British troops, particularly with IEDs. And that is the weapon of choice that caused so many injuries in Afghanistan. So British Special Forces put in initially training Sorry, Mike, I've lost that one. Yeah. Thank you. Originally when the Russians were active in Afghanistan, and now those techniques clearly being used to injure and maim British troops. So not having learnt the lesson, Michael Fallon is very happy to be repeating that process.
Now, of course, everywhere around the white helmets, you get very slick marketing campaigns and very slick fundraising campaigns. But in terms of marketing campaigns, the Save the Children have just started a new marketing campaign, Unite for Child Refugees. And this is really, I'm just going to keep banging on about this because it is such an important subject. Everybody now, plus the dog, is now campaigning to have unaccompanied children brought to this country. Now, of course, in recent days, that's been sort of couched in the language of to hand them over to their families that they've been separated from in the UK. Of course, this isn't mainly the case. Mainly the case is that these children are going into care in the UK. And as we've highlighted, children that end up in care in the UK often end up going out the other side, and nobody really knows what has become of them, into trafficking rings and so on. So what I believe is going on is that we're seeing overtly the child trafficking rings in operation, and we see who's supporting them. Now, Save the Children aren't doing anything to save the children that are affected by the wars in Syria and Iraq because they're not doing anything to campaign against those wars or to prevent those wars. They're simply saying, well, we've got a problem. Let's move these children from their homes. They've been moved from their homes as a result of war, but let's keep moving them. Don't solve the problem, the underlying problem. And they, of course, are pushing this with images. So here we've got a Save the Children page, Iraq in photos, children flee fighting. And the pressure, it's just building to such a huge degree to have these children brought into this country. And nobody yet has answered the question of what happened to 300 plus children, the unaccompanied refugee children that have disappeared out of the care system in this country in the last 12 months. Before we bring any more in, I think we should have answers to those questions.
We couldn't agree more, Mike. Let's continue on this theme. We know that we've got some of our viewers and listeners who have said to us, we find this surprising, but some of our viewers and listeners have said to us, you spend a lot of time commenting on the fact that children are missing. Well, we do, because apart from anything else, children are our future. Children should be protected by society. But we're now witnessing Britain in 2016, we'll say Conservative government, where it is clear the government has no interest in protecting children. And if you dig deeper, the reason for that, of course, is that child abuse is being used for blackmail to keep politicians' heads within the establishment doing what others are bidding. So let's try and emphasise how this looks in UK at the moment. This is the sad case that we have an RAF serviceman who's gone missing, and this is still coming up in the press. People are still looking for this gentleman. The police are still active, and the Telegraph here with a big headline, possible sighting of missing RAF serviceman Corrie McHugh. Now, let's bring in the independent report. This is of some weeks ago. Hundreds of child refugees have vanished since arriving in the UK, prompting trafficking and abuse fears. Well, of course, the headline is misleading because if you read the article, there's no fear about the trafficking and abuse. The paper is stating that many of these children will have been trafficked for abuse. And how many, how many children is the Independent talking about? Well, it's talking about over 360 children simply disappeared. Nobody is looking for them, no police investigation, no public inquiry, no questions in Westminster, a stunning silence at hundreds of children disappearing. But we have Tim Farron, leader of the Lib Dems, grinning on TV when they make a joke of children missing. So what did the Independent say? Well, in the article it said this: over the past 5 years, 9,287 children have sought safety in the UK as unaccompanied minor asylum seekers travelling alone without a parent or guardian. Highly, highly vulnerable children. Many of the children are fleeing war, poverty and persecution in their home countries. During this period, 360 have gone missing and are still unaccounted for. Of these, 81 of the children have been missing for 5 years, a further 77 for 4 years, and another 87 have been missing for 3. So large numbers of children simply disappearing, but absolutely no inquiries, Mike.
Now, somebody in the chat box is mentioning the allegedly older children that were brought in the past week or so. And of course, if you want to divert attention from this scandal, what do? You create a new scandal. So you manufacture some staged images which appear right across the mainstream press, and they create exactly the reaction in people that the mainstream media and the government wants. We've got to highlight the fact that children, small children, in the, pre-10 and to mid-teens are coming into this country, disappearing. And of course, let's not just focus on unaccompanied refugee children here. This has been a national scandal for decades in this country, with people removed from their children removed from their parents, put into care, and then disappearing from care, with not a care on behalf of the police, social services, the charities, including Save the Children Fund and the government. So this, as I've said before, was highlighted in a a government report in 2012, but nothing has been done since 2012 to date to solve this problem, even though that report described it as a national scandal. So it's about time somebody did something, and no more children should be coming here until such times as it's been done.
At which point we need to bring in Theresa May, Prime Minister, but of course former Home Secretary. And what we got here with the Mail headline, have we got here with the Mail headline is, did Theresa May know about racist remarks by ex-child sex abuse inquiry chair? So this is the attack on Goddard after she's left the inquiry. If we put in the reality of this, so this is UK column comment. What is Theresa May really saying as Prime Minister now? Relax, you Westminster establishment child abusers. I've done a great job of creating a merry-go-round child abuse inquiry that will never investigate any serious child abuse and will create confusion, disinformation and cover-up while paying the legal teams huge fees. So this lady has done a remarkably callous but very clever job in creating a child abuse inquiry that is doing nothing except swallowing up huge amounts of taxpayers' money and, of course, spewing out articles in the press which are nothing to do about apprehending people who are abusing children. So if we just move on to where the money's gone, we showed this a couple of days ago. So we've got Ben Emerson, who was being paid £1,700 a day. He's now another one that's left the inquiry. He's also working for the UN. We wouldn't particularly trust the UN, but vast amounts of money simply thrown away and no investigation into the children at all. And as our Metropolitan Police whistleblower said, of course, if the child abuse is being covered up by the police with the help of politicians, local authorities, and the very charities who say they are there to protect the children, there can only be one reason for this, and that is to ultimately protect the child abusers who are currently in power, in government, and at senior levels of the establishment, presumably including the courts and judiciary.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to the South China Sea then. Now, we've been mentioning the Philippines quite a bit recently, and of course, the Filipino President Duterte has been making some pretty strong comments about President Obama and others. Well, this article in Bloomberg is pretty spectacular. They're saying the US can stay friends with the Philippines, they say. And what are they commenting on? They're saying, for a moment last week, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte seemed to have orchestrated one of the most dramatic geopolitical shifts in Asia since the end of the Cold War. And they're referring to the fact that he seems to be realigning himself with China at the moment. And he basically seems to be telling the United States to go away. So he doesn't want US companies in the Philippines anymore. He doesn't want US military in the Philippines anymore. Well, this article had this to say, Brian, and you can tell me what you think of this, but it says the Filipino military has a history of coup and little interest in replacing American weapons, logistical support and training with Russian and Chinese technology. American commanders are no doubt already reminding their Filipino counterparts that a radical break in relations would have strategic consequences. That to me sounded like a threat.
It's an absolute threat, Mike, and of course the American military, huge expenditure on military bases within the Philippines, and if they were to lose those bases, that would dramatically affect US power projection in that area. So I think this is the US at its best, which is somebody dares to challenge the opinion. The threats start. It's quite remarkable. There's been some particularly impressive YouTube clips with President Putin talking about this subject, that if you live in the world and you dare to go against American foreign policy, then you're going to get the big stick treatment, especially, of course, if you're a weak and vulnerable country, but not so quick with the stick if the problem has come from the direction of the Russians. But what he's saying, absolutely correct. America, world's policeman or world's bully? It's
good question.
It's perhaps debatable.
Right, free trade. Now, free trade is becoming right to the centre of British policy. Well, we've been telling you that for over 9 months now, because that was what was made clear when Cameron produced his document on the renegotiation with Europe prior to the referendum. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, these free trade agreements don't seem to be making much progress. So here's Greek press here. And I wanted to highlight this particular article because they begin by saying, for once, Greece could not be blamed for scuppering a major agreement in Brussels. So Greece can't be blamed, and absolutely right, because it's actually a Belgian principality or Belgian region which is causing the problems. And of course, this time we're talking about CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, which is the trade agreement between the EU and Canada. And unfortunately, Belgians, or at least one section of them, don't particularly like it. And so they have put the kibosh on it, and it is not going to, at least certainly doesn't seem to be progressing. So what was said yesterday, it will not be possible for the agreement to be made yesterday. And this is according to the president of Wallonia's parliament, André Antoine. And he said that there's a huge mishmash of text. This is not serious international law. Secondly, ultimatums and threats are not part of democracy. We want a deal, we want a treaty, but we want to negotiate it with a minimum of courtesy and respect. So really, you know, the EU been trying to push this through with the usual bully boy tactics, and at least one section of Belgium not having it. And I'm pretty impressed that one small section of Belgium is holding the rest of the EU to ransom effectively.
Can we just say there, isn't this a wonderful example of the fact that small groups of people properly motivated and saying, no, we're not having it, can cause huge problems? And if more people did it, took an example from Belgium there, we would be doing a lot more. Absolutely.
Now, of course, Britain is positioning itself to be Global Britain. The hashtag from Theresa May is hashtag Global Britain. And right at the heart of Global Britain is free trade agreements. Well, Priti Patel, we like to have her on. We've had her on quite a bit recently because she's the new International Development Secretary. And she has decided that international aid budgets should be used to promote these free trade agreements. So some of the £12 billion foreign aid budget, she says, is going to be used. Our focus, of course, she says, is on poverty reduction, but that doesn't mean we should exclude the whole area of trade and trade opportunities. And she went on to say, British soft power is exactly where the Department for International Development and our aid and other relationships around the world come together to deliver in our national interest and deliver for Britain when it comes to free trade agreements, but also life post-Brexit. And of course, the fake Brexit, the psychological operation, which continues, that we're coming out of the EU. This is being used as the excuse for everything, and it's being used as the excuse to promote these free trade deals. Now, various people have commented on this. Priti Patel has no mandate or evidence to fundamentally change the way UK aid is distributed. She seems fixated on imposing her dogma for the free market over the clear evidence that UK aid is the most efficient and effective in the world. Well, we can debate that. But Patel herself went on to say, we have to make sure that our aid works in our national interest and also works for our taxpayers. Much more openness, much more transparency, much more accountability. Well, perhaps we could start, Ms. Patel, with you telling us where the aid money, the £32 million of non-humanitarian aid that's gone to the White Helmets, what is that going to be spent on exactly? But in the meantime, it is a bit obscene that aid money, which is obscene in any case, but it's particularly obscene when it's being spent on these free trade agreements like TTIP, CETA, and the rest.
Or terrorism.
Well, indeed.
Well, just remind people on the soft power statement, it was Boris Johnson who said at the Conservative Party's conference last month, he set out a vision of Britain as a soft power superpower. projecting values through influence, ideas, and the power of persuasion. If there was ever a time and a place for exercising our national soft power, that time is now, and the place is Mosul. So this is pretty clear what's going on here. There was at one stage a European Union document which talked about the use of soft power through the EU and, in fact, through spheres of influence in the world. And the basic statement was that whilst America relied on hard military power and might to achieve its objectives, the EU was much better at using soft power, which they described as a hidden hand, and that soft power would get inside countries and start to deconstruct or insert the new values. That was a document that disappeared from European websites and registers, but I do remember seeing the basic text of it. And of course, this mirrors what we're seeing at the moment, except Britain saying, well, we're going to do it alone, or we're going to do it simply not recognising we're still part of the European Union.
Right. Constitutional stuff. Chris Skidmore, who is the Minister for the Constitution, apparently, even though, as we've said this before, even though he would say we don't have one. And he was setting out his vision for democracy, for a democracy that works for everyone in the United Kingdom. I have to say, he was giving a speech yesterday about this, and what came across to me, Brian, is a complete panic in political circles about public disengagement, that public cynicism getting to levels that even the cynical political class can't cope with. And it's fascinating. So he said, as Minister for the Constitution responsible for democratic engagement, I want to start by thanking everyone in this room for the work that you do and continue to do to ensure that our democracy is one of the strongest in the world today. And he was talking about panicking over engagement. Our democracy has never been so clear, so overwhelming, and yet already we face calls seeking to undermine the results. Some critics claim that the public were misled, like he's talking about Brexit, of course, with calls to establish a so-called Office of Electoral Integrity, a truth commission to oversee elections. Yet this is talking down the British people as if they're unable to make their own minds up in a democratic election and need to be told how to think. I want to share with you today the government's vision for how we intend to ensure that democracy works for everyone. These broadly fall into four key pillars. First of all, equal seats, the boundary review. So we're going to, because of course that's pretty democratic, to review the boundaries to make sure that only certain parties win in certain areas. That's democratic. Votes for life. Because the government's going to ensure that British citizens who've moved overseas are able to register to vote in future elections. Every voice matters, so they're going to reach out in communities, including those who feel socially excluded, and encourage and empower them to have their say, ensuring no community is left behind. A clear and secure democracy will continue to drive improvements in our electoral registration system to ensure it's fit for the 21st century. So this is all great stuff. He says we cannot allow the status quo in such circumstances to continue, which is why the government is seriously considering proposals contained in Sir Eric Pickle's review into electoral fraud and the Law Commission's report, and will formally respond later in the year, laying out our plans to strengthen the law and deliver on our manifesto pledge to tackle election fraud. Election fraud, and this is a massive acknowledgement, Brian.
Well, quite right too, because it's been going on for years, Mike, and it was very interesting information that UK Column has been receiving from north of the border, where people are saying openly that election fraud is just an ongoing thing in Scotland, and I have had no evidence to back the next bit up, but they were saying that wherever the team was investigating what had happened, the words common purpose were coming up, but we'll see. But
of course, Chris Skidmore, if he wants to investigate election fraud, might, I'm not suggesting there is any, but he might start looking at IDOX and his own colleague, Peter Lilly, and see what they've been up to with counting the postal votes.
Yeah.
Right. Leveson was defeated to a degree, but it never really went again. And there have been many, many calls for Leveson 2 in the meantime. But it doesn't look like Leveson 2, as in the sense of a whole new inquiry, is going to take place. But in the meantime, the hacked off campaign hasn't gone away, and of course they support their version of the press regulator, which is called Impress. And what they intend to do is to seek formal backing from the Press Recognition Panel. This is a quango set up by the government in sort of following Leveson, and it makes a decision about who the press regulator is going to be and so on. So Karen Bradley, who's the Culture Secretary, would then have to decide whether to activate regulations according to this Mail article, which would see, quotes, newspapers face exemplary damages if they're sued for libel. So basically, what if Impress have their way and the Hacked Off campaign, the Media Standards Trust, if they have their way, it would allow the triggering of Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, which would mean that any newspaper that didn't sign up to Impress would have to pay the legal fees of a complainant who sued them for libel, whether they won or lost.
Right. Well, this of course is to protect the elites from any form of investigation because they become too dangerous. The wealthier they are, the more secure they are, and hence our reports on the abuse of children, because point a finger at these people and big problems. But then, of course, we can see power by Cliff Richard being able to go into House of Lords and have a little secret meeting, and as a result, the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, Alison Saunders, simply says, yes, we need to change the law. So we're entering a very interesting period in UK constitution and law. Well, UK Column is going to say we have reported and warned about the attempts to control the press. So we're just going to remind people that these are some of the diagrams that we've put up, trying to warn people of the networks of individuals clearly working together to take control of the press. And in this particular diagram, we were highlighting the influence of Common Purpose. So we have Common Purpose operating through Sir David Bell and Julia Middleton into the Media Standards Trust, but also linked in at that time to Francis Maud, Minister of Transparency, I believe, at the Conservative office, but also a Common Purpose supporter, and he was in position when Common Purpose was trying to win contracts to train the top 200 civil servants. We've got the head of the civil service there, also linked in David Cameron, another Common Purpose supporter, and the very own BBC's Robert Peston, who was in some of the earliest meetings in the offices of Sir David Bell when they talked about setting up the Media Standards Trust. So we have to have the British government's BBC in the corner, because of course that is the propaganda machine helping to stitch things together. And it does get more complicated, but if you spend the time, you can put the picture together. And Mike's mentioned the attempt to regulate the press. We've got Impress here, central, and these are some of the people connected with it via the board, but also, of course, individuals such as Max Mosley have become very important in pressurising that people in higher positions in the establishment who become focus of press interest should be able to close that investigation down.
Yeah, well, and indeed he is the poster boy for this latest attempt.
Right. Well, what a fine example.
Yes.
And we'll just say it was there on the front page of the UK column. The Leveson inquiry, it was the UK column that exposed the work of Common Purpose behind. And we are delighted that the Daily Mail decided to take up our research and produce that 10 or 11 page expose, which I think did make a difference.
Yes. Winchester?
Winchester. Well, just to say, tickets are going very quickly now for the conference. If you haven't bought tickets, we suggest that you get online and get some of those paid for. People are clearly reacting to the basic tenet of this conference, which is that Britain is now a lawless country, and the job of the wider public is to work together to reassert the rule of law.
And nowhere more lawless than the financial system. And well, this is quite incredible in a sense because, everywhere we look now, Brian, we're seeing faction fighting within the establishment. And it's really quite incredible. So this is a 150-page report Reuters is highlighting here from the New City Agenda think tank and in collaboration with the Cass Business School. And they are really attacking the two British financial regulators, the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority. These both, since the 2007-2008 financial crash, sort of rolled into the Bank of England. So it's really an attack on the Bank of England. And they're accusing the FSA of groupthink, box ticking, watering down rules. They're saying unless we change the culture of regulators, we will be sleepwalking into the next financial crisis. So, I'm not really going to say any more about this at this point, but I'm just finding it incredible that everywhere we look, we see infighting and faction fighting amongst groups that have been traditionally supportive of each other.
Yeah, which has got to be a good thing.
Absolutely. What's next?
Defence, I think, is the key subject.
Yes, so this is Trident Juncture 2016. This is taking place at RAF St Morgan in Cornwall, and it's bringing together 21 NATO allies. We've got 300 UK personnel, 500 personnel from Albania, Belgium, Canada, Croatia, Estonia, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, and the United States. They're going to demonstrate readiness, flexibility, and capability of the new NATO Rapid Reaction Corps. So we're going to react rapidly, all 800 people, between yesterday and I think the 4th of November. So that's pretty exciting. Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, said the UK-led exercise will ensure NATO is match fit to deal with any threat or crisis situation. Strengthening NATO is the cornerstone of Europe's defence, and that makes Britain safer and more secure. So this is all about European defence and how it operates with NATO.
Yeah, and it's grouping up these other countries to do the job. They're going to be in the firing line, so you make sure this is Britain's soft power at work. But an amazing mix of countries there, Mike, and I'm pretty confident in saying that within a few days there will be utter chaos in the communication system, because that is the way it always worked. The moment NATO exercises started to encompass more than 3 or 4 of the most central and professional military. So
I don't think we need to worry anymore. They've got Google Translate working in real time. It must be fine.
Okay. Well, of course, while Michael Fallon is boasting that, let's not forget that Royal Marine Sergeant Alexander Blackman remains in prison, and many people, including, of course, many of his colleagues, campaigning to get this man released. Let's remember what this means. It means that you sign up for the British military, you go and fight the wars created by Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or David Cameron, and you put a foot wrong, you're going to end up in a court and in prison, excuse me, whereas, of course, Mr. Blair and others who created the wars in the first place are simply making millions touring the world giving speeches. So we think, excuse me, that we have a little bit of a problem with this at the moment. Definitely suffering from a frog this morning, bear with me. So Friday coming up from 11:30 to 2 o'clock, there's going to be another rally for Sergeant Alexander Blackman, which will be at Westminster. These are extremely well disciplined, so these will be colleagues coming together to express their concern. He's still in prison. There will be some talks to the public present, but the idea is that this is carried out in a very quiet, professional, disciplined way. And these men are quite right, of course, that what sort of government have we got, Mike, that imprisons members of the armed forces who've served their country? It's pretty horrible stuff. And let's contrast it, of course, with what happens if you set up a company which is ripe to get government business So here is the Red Snapper recruitment organisation that's been recruiting all of the legal teams used to prosecute the troops. So let's bring him up on screen. Here he is, Michael Fallon. And of course, he said forces will be protected against spurious legal claims. But we're going to add a bit to that. The real intention is to continue to undermine the armed forces with cuts, change and transformation while protecting Blair, Brown and Cameron, who started the unlawful conflicts in the first place. And of course, he's particularly happy that Chilcot did such a great job producing thousands and thousands of pages which showed nothing. And let's just remind people that that inquiry took place. What did it ultimately achieve? Nothing. Nothing. But the same government can put a Royal Marine sergeant who served in a particularly unpleasant battlefield, can put him in prison. So this is the elite. This is Tony Blair's unelected elite that he said he was going to create. These people are simply in power in Westminster. They regard themselves above the law, whether it's creating wars overseas or, for some of them, abusing children. Dangerous times. Where does that take us? Well, we can expect the BBC to report on some of this, or maybe not. We decided to have a look at the BBC's website today, and it's hard to find anything of substance on it. Of course, third runway at Heathrow was a very big issue for the BBC, but the rest of it is sort of mind-numbing articles here. We've got the 30-second chat triggering weight loss. We've got the Calais camp, Heathrow there, Hong Kong trial shown a torture video. Well, we can talk about who's murdering who in Hong Kong. We can't look for the missing children. And on it goes. They've got to bring in the papers because presumably with 3.65 billion, they can't get enough news in. And it goes on. We've got cancer scares. We've got UK's budget tightrope, which you've reported, Mike. And then we've got video clips, most of which are complete dross, is the word I like to use. So if the website's not enough, we need to have a look at their Twitter page. And I'd encourage people to go and have a look at this, because if you look carefully at the image at the top, the banner image, you can see the busy BBC studios where a very large number of the desks are empty. So I don't know whether that's people away for a coffee break, or perhaps they're on holiday or simply not bothered to turn up. But despite these massive facilities, almost no real news at all. But I did pick up on Chris Grayling there. And if we click on his little video clip, he had this to say: "We believe a third runway for Heathrow is the best option for our future, the best option for the whole country. It's going to give better connectivity to the regions of UK and to provide the best trade links to the world." So I think if you just think those comments through, Mike, there's some extraordinary statements. We need a third runway at Heathrow to connect people in London with people in Truro, for example. We've got a tiny country. We need this new runway in order to connect people together in Britain. I don't think so. He then says we need the third runway in order for Britain to be able to trade properly with the rest of the world. I'm not sure how that works either. So if we look at the rest of the tweeting, just to show you how bad it is, we've got Nottingham in Parliament apparently, because Nottingham doesn't get enough coverage apart from child abuse, but nobody wants to talk about that. So they're having a special Nottingham in Parliament Day. We've got people killed on a ride. I think this is in Australia. Clearly important news for Britain because it's more death mainly. And we've got this one. This is Breakfast TV with some actor. I don't know who. I'm not going to bother to read it. This is another BBC article with a ballerina. I don't know who she is. I'm not going to read it, but it's important national news, Mike. They have got a little section which, of course, is hammering Trump, because the BBC only likes to hammer Trump. and nothing of any substance on the Hillary Clinton sagas of the breach of national security in the States. It's just Trump. And of course, we've got to have Strictly Come Dancing here because this is of major national importance. I couldn't find anything on the BBC website, Mike, or indeed their Twitter page about missing children.
No.
I wonder why. Well, we have to say at the end of today's news that sometimes when we are looking for news to report or news to analyse, we are quite taken by the fact that across all of Britain's mainstream newspapers and the BBC channel, ITN and the rest of them, there is no reportable news. And it appears to us at the moment that we're watching a massive propaganda attack on the nation. Why would that be? To hide Brexit, do we think? Or possibly the start of another war?
Quite possibly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of today's news. Thank you very much for joining us. If you don't subscribe to UK Column yet, please would you consider doing so. We can only do what we do with your help and support. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.